At 3:22 a.m. Dallas time, while I was shoulder deep in server racks trying to isolate a ransomware attack that had completely locked down First National Bank Texas's entire network. My phone buzzed against my belt. I ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and again. I pulled off my work gloves and checked the screen. Dennis Crawford, my supervisor at Secure Shield Technologies, calling from headquarters at what would be normal business hours for him. I almost didn't answer. When you're managing a cybersecurity crisis that's costing $180,000 per hour in lost banking operations, phone calls from corporate feel less urgent than the red warning alerts flashing across every screen in the data center. But I answered anyway, because that's what 22 years of being the guy who fixes the unfixable conditions you to do. Old habits from the Air Force die hard. Morrison speaking. Brad, it's Dennis. I need to inform you of a company decision. Effective immediately, we no longer require your services as senior cybersecurity architect. Your employment is terminated as of today. I looked at the monitoring station in front of me. Ransomware signature 0x7F3A still propagating through backup servers. Database encryption at 73% complete. Core banking systems completely offline along with ATM networks and online services due to security lockdown protocols. Rachel Thompson, First National's IT director, standing 10 feet away looking at me like I was her last hope, because I was literally the only person who understood their custom security framework well enough to reverse engineer a solution this complex. I understand, I said, keeping my voice level. I'll inform the bank director that you'll be handling the recovery procedures for the crisis I'm currently managing. Silence long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. What crisis? The ransomware attack that brought me to Dallas yesterday. The entire banking network is encrypted. The attack is costing approximately $180,000 per hour in lost operations. I'm in the middle of reverse engineering the encryption key derivation algorithm. I assume you'll want to send someone else to complete the recovery since I no longer work for Secure Shield. More silence. I could hear him breathing. Brad, let's discuss this after you've resolved the First National situation. I don't think that's appropriate. You just terminated my employment. I shouldn't be working on Secure Shield projects if I'm no longer a Secure Shield employee. I'll brief Rachel on what I've discovered so far and catch the next flight back to Michigan. Back to my family and the retirement planning I should probably focus on now. Wait, Brad, let me call you back. He ended the call before I could respond. My name is Bradley Morrison. I'm 56 years old, and I just got fired while managing a cybersecurity crisis that nobody else at my company knows how to solve. Before I explain what happened over the next 72 hours, let me establish who I am and why that phone call was the most expensive mistake Dennis Crawford ever made. I joined Secure Shield Technologies in 2002 as a cybersecurity engineer specializing in financial institution network security. Before that, I'd spent 8 years in the Air Force working on communication systems security at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. The military taught me discipline, attention to detail, and how to work under pressure when lives and missions depended on getting things right the first time. Those skills translated perfectly to civilian cybersecurity work, where bank failures could wipe out people's life savings and community businesses. Secure Shield designs and maintains cybersecurity infrastructure for banks, credit unions, and financial services companies where data breaches can cost millions, and network downtime shuts down entire regional economies. My role was responding to complex security incidents that standard cybersecurity protocols couldn't handle. When a bank got hit with sophisticated malware and their IT department couldn't crack it, they called Secure Shield. Secure Shield sent me. Over 22 years, I'd responded to 287 cybersecurity emergencies across 11 states. I'd reverse-engineered custom ransomware, traced advanced persistent threats, recovered encrypted databases, rebuilt compromised authentication systems, and eliminated dozens of attack vectors that could paralyze multi-billion-dollar financial institutions. Most importantly, I developed deep institutional knowledge about the specific security frameworks Secure Shield had designed and implemented. Every client had unique requirements. Every installation had custom modifications. Every system had vulnerabilities and edge cases that existed only in my experience-based understanding of how those networks behaved under attack. My wife Susan always said I collected broken networks like some men collected vintage cars. She was probably right. After 30 years of marriage, she knew me better than anyone. Our 2 kids, now adults with kids of their own, Used to joke that Dad could fix any computer but couldn't program the TV remote. They weren't wrong about the remote, but they understood that what I did mattered. When their local bank's ATMs worked during a regional outage, there was a good chance their old man had something to do with keeping those systems running. That knowledge was what made me valuable. That knowledge was also what Dennis Crawford had just eliminated from Secure Shield's available expertise at the worst possible moment. The First National crisis had started 38 hours earlier. First National Bank Texas, one of Secure Shield's largest clients, had called our emergency hotline at 9:15 p.m. Central Time on Thursday, reporting that their entire network had been compromised by ransomware. First National operated 47 branch locations across Texas and processed approximately $180,000 per hour in transaction volume during normal business operations. Complete network lockdown meant they couldn't process transactions, access customer accounts, or operate ATMs across their entire footprint. Secure Shield's standard protocol for cybersecurity incidents was to start with remote analysis. I spent 4 hours on encrypted video calls with First National's IT team, examining network logs, analyzing malware signatures, and reviewing the attack timeline. By 1 a.m., I determined this wasn't something that could be resolved remotely. The attack pattern suggested a sophisticated ransomware variant that had specifically targeted First National's custom authentication protocols and encrypted their primary database clusters using a proprietary key derivation algorithm. This was the kind of challenge that reminded me why I'd stayed in this field for so long. Complex problems that required experience, intuition, and the kind of methodical approach the Air Force had drilled into me decades ago. I booked a flight to Dallas, departing Friday morning at 7 a.m., arrived at 9:30 a.m. local time, went directly from the airport to First National's data center facility. Rachel Thompson, First National's IT director, met me at the security checkpoint. She looked like she hadn't slept in 30 hours. "Mr. Morrison, thank God you're here. We've been completely offline for 36 hours. Our customers can't access accounts, we can't process payments, and corporate is demanding answers we don't have. I need direct access to your primary servers and network monitoring systems," I said. "This attack signature matches a ransomware family I've seen before, but the encryption implementation is more sophisticated." She led me to the data center. Rows of server racks lined the facility, most displaying red fault indicators. Multiple monitoring stations showed encrypted file systems, corrupted databases, and the distinctive signature of the Crimson Spider ransomware family. All silent, all locked, all costing First National $180,000 per hour. I spent the next 8 hours analyzing the attack vector, reverse engineering the encryption algorithm, and tracing the ransomware's propagation pattern through First National's network. The methodical approach reminded me of troubleshooting communication arrays in the Air Force, except instead of keeping pilots connected to ground control, I was trying to keep families connected to their bank accounts. Same principle, higher stakes. By 6 p.m. Friday, I'd identified the vulnerability that allowed initial access and isolated the algorithm the ransomware was using to generate encryption keys. The attack had exploited a zero-day vulnerability in First National's custom customer authentication system that Secure Shield had designed and implemented 3 years ago. It was elegant, sophisticated, and exactly the kind of attack that required someone who understood both the original system design and current threat landscapes. Here's what happened. The attackers had identified a buffer overflow vulnerability in the authentication module and used it to gain administrative access to First National's domain controllers. From there, they deployed Crimson Spider ransomware configured with a custom key derivation function that made standard decryption tools useless. The ransomware was specifically engineered to target financial institutions using Secure Shield's authentication framework. The vulnerability was in custom code that Secure Shield had written specifically for First National's installation. That code existed in only 4 other banks. I'd been part of the team that designed and implemented it. I was one of 2 people in the entire world who understood how the authentication handshake worked at the assembly language level. Fixing it required reverse engineering the key derivation function, exploiting a timing vulnerability in the ransomware's encryption routine, recovering the master decryption keys from residual memory, and then systematically decrypting and restoring 847 gigabytes of database files across 23 server clusters. I estimated 16 to 20 hours of work. I started at 7 p.m. Friday night. The work reminded me why I'd stayed in this field for so long. There's something satisfying about taking apart a complex problem piece by piece, understanding how each component works, and then rebuilding it better than it was before. Susan used to say I approached broken networks like a mechanic approaches a classic car engine, with patience, respect, and an absolute refusal to give up until it purrs perfectly. By 3 a.m. Saturday, I'd successfully reverse-engineered the key derivation algorithm and was in the process of extracting encryption keys from memory dumps when Dennis called and told me I was fired. After Dennis hung up, Rachel approached me cautiously. "Brad, you look concerned. Is everything okay? I just got terminated by my employer while in the middle of recovering your banking systems." Her expression went from tired to panicked. "Terminated? But you're the only person who understands our security framework. What happens to our systems?" "That's an excellent question. Secure Shield will need to send someone else to complete the recovery. How long will that take?" "The only other engineer who understands your authentication system is Mason Turner. Mason is in Colorado managing a credit union breach. Secure Shield might have to wait until he becomes available." "How long?" "Mason's engagement in Colorado is scheduled for another 10 days. After that, he'd need time to review your system documentation and understand the attack pattern. Could be 2 weeks total." Rachel's face went white. "We can't wait 2 weeks. Every day offline costs us $4.3 million in lost operations. 2 weeks would be over $60 million in losses, plus regulatory penalties, plus customer exodus. Then I suggest you contact Secure Shield Corporate and explain the urgency." At 4:47 a.m., my phone rang again. This time it was Jeremy Foster, Secure Shield's Chief Technology Officer. Jeremy had been with the company for 18 years and understood exactly how critical my role was to incident response. "Brad, I just got off the phone with Dennis. There's been a misunderstanding about your employment status. We need you to complete the first national engagement before we discuss any personnel matters." "Jeremy, Dennis was very clear. He said my employment was terminated effective immediately. That's not a misunderstanding. That's termination." "I understand this is confusing, but let's focus on resolving First National's crisis first. We can address your employment situation after you've restored their banking operations. I don't think that's appropriate. If I'm terminated, I shouldn't be working on Secure Shield projects. If I'm not terminated, then Dennis needs to call me back and clarify that he made an error. This is a critical client situation. First National is one of our largest accounts. They're losing hundreds of thousands of dollars per hour. We need you to complete the recovery work, then you need to clarify my employment status first. Am I a Secure Shield employee or not?" Long pause. I could hear Jeremy thinking through the implications. If he said I was still employed, he'd be contradicting Dennis's termination and creating internal political problems. If he said I was terminated, he'd be admitting that Secure Shield had just eliminated their crisis response capability in the middle of their most expensive emergency. The Air Force had taught me that in crisis situations, clear communication and defined chain of command matter more than anything else. Right now, Secure Shield's chain of command was giving me contradictory orders. "Brad, let me conference in Dennis so we can resolve this together. I'd rather you didn't." Dennis was clear about his decision. "I'm respecting that decision by no longer working on Secure Shield projects. If First National needs assistance, they should contact Secure Shield's emergency response line and request another engineer. There is no other engineer available who understands First National's custom authentication system. That's an unfortunate situation, but it's not my problem anymore since I'm no longer a Secure Shield employee." I ended the call. Rachel was standing nearby, having heard my side of the conversation. "What should we do, Brad?" "You should contact Secure Shield and request emergency cybersecurity support. Explain the urgency of the situation. They'll prioritize getting someone here as quickly as possible. But you're here now. You understand our systems. You were in the middle of recovering our data. Can't you just complete the work?" "I was fired 43 minutes ago. I can't ethically continue working on a project for a company that just terminated my employment. What if we hired you directly, not through Secure Shield, but as an independent consultant working for First National?" I thought about that carefully. In the Air Force, we had strict protocols about chain of command and proper authorization. This situation felt similar. I needed clear authority before proceeding. That would create contractual complications. First National has a cybersecurity service agreement with Secure Shield. That agreement probably has exclusivity provisions preventing you from hiring outside consultants to work on Secure Shield designed systems. I'll check our contract. She pulled out her phone and called First National's legal department, had a rapid conversation that I couldn't follow completely, hung up and looked at me with cautious optimism. Our legal team says the service agreement has exclusivity provisions for routine maintenance, but emergency incident response can be conducted by any qualified consultant if Secure Shield cannot provide timely support. They're defining timely support as within 24 hours of request. Has First National formally requested emergency support from Secure Shield? I'll do that right now. She sent an email to Secure Shield's emergency response team with me copied, formally, requesting immediate cybersecurity incident response for the ransomware attack and noting that the previous engineer, me, was no longer available to complete the recovery work. She marked it urgent and requested response within 4 hours. At 7:23 a.m., we received a response from Secure Shield's incident coordinator. We acknowledge your request for emergency cybersecurity support. Our senior incident response engineers are currently committed to other client emergencies. We are working to identify available resources and will provide an estimated response timeline within 12 hours. 12 hours, meaning First National would be offline for at least another half day, probably longer, meaning another $2.2 million in lost operations at minimum. Rachel showed me the email. What does this mean? It means Secure Shield doesn't have anyone available to send. Mason is in Colorado. Amanda Richardson is on medical leave recovering from surgery, and apparently nobody else at Secure Shield has the expertise to handle Crimson Spider ransomware variants. So we wait, unless you want to exercise your contract provision and hire an independent consultant. Are you available as an independent consultant? I could be. What would your rate structure be? I thought about that carefully. Independent cybersecurity consulting rates for emergency incident response typically range from $400 to $900 per hour, depending on expertise level and urgency. I was at the top of the expertise scale, and this was definitely urgent. More importantly, I had a mortgage to finish paying off and retirement plans that had just been disrupted by unexpected unemployment. $800 per hour for emergency incident response, minimum 30-hour engagement to ensure complete recovery and system hardening. That's $24,000 total, payment terms 50% deposit before I resume work, remaining 50% upon successful system restoration. Rachel didn't hesitate. Done. I'll have our finance department process the deposit immediately. At 9:15 a.m. Saturday morning, $12,000 cleared into my business account. I'd opened that account years ago for occasional freelance work, never thinking I'd need it for full-time consulting. At 9:30 a.m., I resumed work on First National's ransomware recovery. The work felt different now. Instead of being an employee following company protocols, I was an independent contractor with direct accountability to the client. The Air Force had taught me the importance of mission focus, and now my mission was crystal clear: restore First National's banking operations as quickly and completely as possible. By 6 p.m. Saturday afternoon, I'd successfully extracted all encryption keys and was beginning systematic database decryption. The process reminded me of diffusing ordnance, methodical, careful, with no room for shortcuts or mistakes. Each decrypted database cluster brought more of First National's banking operations back online. By 11 p.m., the core banking systems were operational with no data loss. By 1 a.m. Sunday, all branch networks were restored. Total downtime, 52 hours. Total operational loss, approximately $9.4 million. But the systems were running again, and the security patches I'd implemented would prevent reoccurrence of the authentication vulnerability. Rachel was watching the monitoring stations with visible relief as transaction processing resumed across all 47 branches. Brad, I cannot thank you enough. You saved us from a disaster that would have been catastrophically worse if we'd waited for Secure Shield to send another engineer. You're welcome. I'll prepare a technical report documenting the attack vector, recovery procedures, and security recommendations. You should share that with Secure Shield so they can update their other clients using similar authentication frameworks. Will you be available if we have questions during the follow-up period? Yes, my consulting arrangement includes 30 days of follow-up support for any issues related to this incident. At 2:34 a.m. Sunday night, I received a call from Jeremy Foster. I was back at my hotel, exhausted but satisfied with the weekend's work. More importantly, I was starting to realize that this unexpected career transition might not be the disaster I'd initially thought. Brad, I understand you completed the First National recovery as an independent consultant. We need to discuss your employment status. Jeremy, Dennis's decision to terminate me was clear. I'm now operating as an independent consultant. It's more lucrative, and I have better control over which projects I accept. What does that mean for Secure Shield? You're our most experienced incident response engineer. It means Secure Shield will need to develop other engineers with similar expertise or accept that your incident response capability is significantly reduced. That's not acceptable. We have ongoing client emergencies that require your specific knowledge. Then Secure Shield should have considered that before terminating me while I was literally in the middle of managing one of those emergencies. The conversation was becoming familiar. In the military, we had a saying, "Poor planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on my part." Secure Shield was discovering that lesson the expensive way. Brad, I understand you're upset about how Dennis handled the situation. I'm not upset, Jeremy. I'm simply making rational business decisions based on new information. Dennis demonstrated that Secure Shield doesn't value my contributions enough to avoid terminating me during a crisis. I've learned from that demonstration. What would it take to bring you back to Secure Shield? I'm not interested in coming back, but I'm willing to discuss limited consulting arrangements for specific emergencies where my expertise is genuinely necessary. What would those arrangements look like? Secure Shield can retain me as an emergency incident consultant, $800 per hour for active incident response, $5,000 monthly, retainer for availability and consultation, 6-month contract renewable at my discretion. I work remotely unless travel is absolutely necessary, and travel time is billed at the active incident rate. Silence while Jeremy processed the numbers. My previous salary as senior cybersecurity architect had been $108,000 annually. I was now proposing a consulting arrangement that would cost Secure Shield approximately $60,000 annually just for the retainer, plus potentially hundreds of thousands more if they actually needed me for incident response work. That's significantly more expensive than your previous compensation. That's correct, but it's less expensive than what happened at First National when you didn't have me available. They lost $9.4 million during 52 hours of downtime. They would have lost over $60 million if they'd waited 2 weeks for Mason to become available. I need to discuss this with executive leadership. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. Over the next 4 weeks, received 9 emergency calls from former Secure Shield clients experiencing cybersecurity incidents. Each call followed the same pattern. Critical system compromise, Secure Shield couldn't send an engineer quickly enough. Could I help as an independent consultant? I helped all 9 clients. Total consulting revenue, $127,000 for 4 weeks of work. The work reminded me why I'd enjoyed this field for so long. Instead of dealing with corporate politics and budget meetings, I was focused purely on solving problems for clients who genuinely appreciated my expertise. Each successful recovery built my reputation and led to referrals. Word spreads fast in the cybersecurity industry. By June, I was receiving calls from banks that had never worked with Secure Shield, asking if I was available for incident response and ongoing security consulting. By August, I had 6 long-term consulting contracts with financial institutions who wanted guaranteed access to my expertise when they needed it. Combined, retainer revenue, $38,000 monthly, approximately $456,000 annually, plus additional project fees. In September, Secure Shield formally offered me the consulting arrangement I'd proposed to Jeremy. $800 per hour active work, $5,000 monthly retainer, 6-month renewable contract. I accepted because it was guaranteed revenue, and Secure Shield represented one of the most reliable sources of incident response work. Dennis Crawford lasted until November. The board terminated him after they calculated that his decision to fire me during the First National crisis had cost Secure Shield approximately $1.7 million in lost client confidence, incident response costs, and consulting fees. They were now paying me instead of employing me directly. The $1.7 million breakdown. First National had reduced their annual service contract with Secure Shield by $340,000, citing concerns about response capability. 2 other major clients had similarly reduced their contracts after hearing about the First National situation. Secure Shield had paid premium rates to reassign Mason from Colorado to cover incidents I would have handled, incurring approximately $87,000 in expedited travel and overtime costs, and they were now paying me $60,000 annually in retainer fees, plus incident rates that were 35% higher than my previous compensation. All because Dennis had decided to fire me at 3:22 a.m. while I was literally recovering from a $180,000 per hour cybersecurity crisis. Jeremy called me in December. "Brad, I want you to know that Secure Shield has restructured our incident response management. Dennis is no longer with the company. We've learned from this situation." What have you learned? That institutional knowledge has value that isn't captured in salary comparisons. That incident response capability requires deep expertise that can't be quickly replaced. That decisions about personnel should consider operational impact, not just budget line items. Those are good lessons we'd like to discuss. Bringing you back as a full-time employee, we're prepared to offer significantly improved compensation and a formal role as Director of Cybersecurity Incident Response. I appreciate that, but I'm earning more as an independent consultant than I ever did as a Secure Shield employee, and I have better work-life balance because I choose which projects to accept. But you built your career at Secure Shield. We value your contributions. We want to make this right. Jeremy, you can make this right by continuing our consulting arrangement and by valuing your remaining engineers appropriately. Don't repeat with someone else what Dennis did to me. We've learned from the $1.7 million lesson. I stayed independent. By late 2024, I was managing 11 long-term consulting relationships with financial institutions across 8 states. Annual revenue was approaching $520,000. I was working approximately 65% of the hours I'd worked at Secure Shield while earning nearly 5 times my previous salary. More importantly, I was valued. When clients called me for incident response, they understood they were paying premium rates for premium expertise. Nobody called me too expensive. Nobody questioned whether my approach was worth the investment. They'd all seen what happened when they tried to solve cybersecurity crises without specialized knowledge. The financial security meant Susan and I could finally plan that retirement we'd been talking about for years. Our kids were proud of how I'd handled the situation. My son, who works in IT himself, said I'd become something of a legend in cybersecurity circles. "Dad, you're the guy who got fired mid-crisis and then made the company pay triple to get you back." That's the kind of story people tell at conferences. My daughter, who'd always worried about corporate instability affecting our family, was relieved that I now had control over my career trajectory. "You'll never have to worry about someone like Dennis again because you're your own boss." Now, in early 2025, I was invited to speak at the Southwest Cybersecurity Conference about crisis response management. I used the first national situation as a case study, anonymizing details, but explaining how a single personnel decision during a crisis had cost a consulting firm millions in long-term impact. The presentation focused on 3 principles I'd learned both in the Air Force and in civilian cybersecurity work. First, institutional knowledge is operational infrastructure. When you eliminate experienced engineers during active crisis, you're not reducing payroll. You're destroying critical capabilities that took decades to develop. Second, crisis response expertise is economically valuable precisely because it's rare and difficult to replace. Companies that treat crisis engineers as interchangeable commodities learn expensive lessons when crises occur and nobody knows how to solve them. Third, the cost of expertise is always less than the cost of downtime. An $800 per hour consultant who can restore a $180,000 per hour banking system in 52 hours is dramatically less expensive than waiting 2 weeks for a cheaper alternative. After the presentation, 7 companies approached me about consulting engagements or permanent positions. I declined the permanent positions and accepted 2 consulting arrangements. The irony isn't lost on me. Secure Shield paid me $108,000 annually to maintain their crisis response capability. Now they pay me $60,000 annually just to be available, plus $800 per hour when they actually need me. Last year, Secure Shield paid me approximately $197,000 total for retainer and crisis work, nearly double my former salary, and I'm still less expensive than what the first national crisis would have cost if they'd eliminated me 6 months earlier instead of mid-crisis. Here's what I learned from the entire experience. The most dangerous employee to fire isn't the one who complains about salary or threatens to quit. It's the one who's literally in the middle of solving a crisis that nobody else knows how to solve when you decide they're expendable. Because when you fire that person, you don't just lose their future contributions. You lose their ability to prevent the immediate disaster that's happening right now. And you discover that replacing specialized expertise during an emergency is impossible. You can only wait until the crisis becomes catastrophic enough that economic reality forces you to pay whatever it takes to get that expertise back. Dennis wanted to reduce headcount and eliminate what he saw as an expensive senior engineer. He got exactly what he wanted. I was eliminated, the headcount was reduced, and the salary line item disappeared from his budget. What he didn't anticipate was that my salary was actually insurance against cybersecurity disasters. When he eliminated that insurance, he immediately discovered why it existed. Sometimes the best revenge isn't proving people wrong, it's letting them experience the full cost of being right about what they wanted. 47 minutes after firing me, he was calling back, trying to undo his decision. Then he got to explain to his executives why the company's most critical client crisis was costing an additional $4.3 million per day, because the engineer who could fix it was no longer employed. I didn't sabotage SecureShield. I didn't cause First National's crisis. I didn't prevent other engineers from solving the problem. I simply wasn't there anymore to solve problems that only I knew how to solve because I was no longer required.